Barbara Graham's case is a shocking miscarriage of justice, and a declaration should be made by the Governor of the State of California to rectify this injustice, which stands to this day. This treatise proves her innocence. Read by David DePinner, LLB. Barbara was convicted of the murder of Mabel Monaghan in 1953 and executed in 1955.
Mabel Monaghan, contrary to the way the prosecution presented her, was not a frail woman. Not at all. Her age was 63, and she was an ex-champion high skating roller of Los Angeles and had toured the United States, America. And she was a strong woman, self-possessed, and to demean her and make her less than and frail is to do a shocking disservice to a brave woman who deserves, quite frankly, the bloody George Cross if she was in England, because she stood up to her interrogators, vicious, shocking, horrible torturers and criminals, Emmett Perkins and Jack Santer, John True, possibly Baxter Short. And as this will show you, not Barbara Graham. The pillowcase was on, covering Mabel Monaghan's face. Over her head, John True said, he must have said, because Shorter was dead. Yet the evidence was presented as if it was Shorter's. The bleeding face was seen when Shorter entered. But the pillowcase had been put on immediately before, according to John True. Baxter Shorter entered. He saw blood on a rug, John True kneeling, Mrs. Mabel Monaghan gagged, her face bleeding, as we have said, her hands tied. She was lying down the end of a hall, at the other end of the house here, and Emmett Perkins was standing there, Barbara Graham leaning over Mrs. Monaghan, and she handed a gun. This was seen by Baxter Shorter, according to John True. Baxter Shorter made one statement. He said, around March the 26th, when he went in to see police, that he'd met a man named John, an acquaintance whom he refused to name and who was later revealed to be a man he'd known for 2 years or so, named William Upshaw. And the three of them had met at a drive-in eatery at El Monte, Southern California, and had there he'd been told that there was to be a break-in of Mrs. Monaghan's house. And that she wasn't there. They said she wasn't there. A direct quote. They. John and Emmett and Jack, then, whom he met, he said, for the first time the next day, March the 9th, that night, John drove up in a dark blue Oldsmobile. Shorter was waiting at the smokehouse at Ventura Boulevard, or near it. That's how it's identified. Or El Monte at the drive-in eatery again. Where they met is blurred and obscured. John had driven up in the Oldsmobile. What car Shorter had or arrived in, how he got there, is not recorded. But in his statement, Baxter Shorter said that another car drove up. In it were two men and a woman. The men were called Jack and Emmett. He didn't know their last names and never got them, he said. And the woman, he thought they called her Mary. Without any discussion or going into the smokehouse, if that was the rendezvous, or the drive-in eatery at El Monte, if that was, without any discussion, according to Shorter, the three got out of that car and they all got into John's car, his Oldsmobile, and in one single car, drove over to Mrs. Monaghan's house at Burbank, and the Oldsmobile drove up to the curb. Jack said, quote, "We'll send the woman up first," close quotes, in front of them all in the one car. Shorter saw the woman they called Mary, according to him, go up the path after getting out of that Oldsmobile, go up the path and up to the porch and ring a bell or knock in other versions, which means she doesn't seem to have had a knob on the front door, because as they cased the house that morning before dawn, according to Shorter, they cased it accurately and went up to it and around it and about it, they would have found out whether or not they could turn a knob and get in if it was a break-in, and she wasn't there because Shorter said she wasn't there, even though the floodlights were on when they cased Mabel Monaghan's house. But nevertheless, John Truth's statement said that they went up in two cars, and therefore that Shorter heard her called Mary in a car when, according to True, Shorter was in another car with Perkins, only the two, and a woman he called and identified as Barbara Graham was in one other car with him, that is True and Santa. Then, divided, going down the road to Burbank in two cars, two separate cars, not in the woman's presence, did Santa and Emmett call her Mary, or in True's presence, and Jack and Emmett's, in front of Shorter, call her Mary. As, therefore, according to True, if there were two cars, Shorter's evidence of what Jack and Emmett and True called her at once, all together, all in her presence and his, back at El Monte, back at the smokehouse, whichever it was, wasn't admissible against her as Barbara Graham or Mary, as her presence couldn't be established back at the beginning there at Ventura Boulevard, the smokehouse, or El Monte, because they all had to be together, and she called Mary in the presence of each other, because that was the evidence of Shorter in one car in the Oldsmobile that John True said in evidence came later after the murder and wasn't even there. But how did Shorter know it was dark blue? Unless John True drove it to the meeting he had with Shorter and Upshaw at El Monte at the drive-in eatery, the same one. It's indicated he said he met them on March the 9th in the evening and not the smokehouse, even though John True said the rendezvous was the smokehouse. At least the evidence does. But at the meeting on March the 8th, an explanation could be that Shorter saw the dark blue Oldsmobile when John True attended the meeting with he and Upshaw. Which meeting, according to Shorter, was the only one that ever occurred on March the 8th, because Shorter made it quite clear that he met Jack and Emmett and a woman he said they called Mary in all of their presence, including John True arriving in the Oldsmobile dark blue. Shorter swore around March the 26th, when he went into Burbank Police and Detective Comedy He made a statement, Shorter did, with his attorney present, and approached and paved the way, and therefore was the first one in a way to direct the play. And Set claimed they called a woman named Mary, who was there in all of their presence. When three drove up, 2 men and a woman, and that's when he thought they called the woman Mary. At that car, as they got out and all got into True's Oldsmobile that True said wasn't there, and in the presence of the 4 was called Mary, and that's how Shorter first established a woman was there. And Detective Richard Rubel knew when he joined the investigation around March the 30th, then, of a woman introduced in that way, that manner, that unreasonable manner in law, into the play, into the story, and she was called Mary, identified by True as Barbara Graham, hearsay, 2 cars, associated by Rubel as Barbara Graham because she worked for Emmett, and Rubel knew a woman who'd used the name Mary according to the evidence. A woman named Barbara Graham used the name Mary as a prostitute, and that he'd been told this because he'd known Emmett for 13 years. And yet, Barbara Graham's file does not mention Mary. But Mary, the reference to her was hearsay, and the 4 men there in 1 car added a convenient reason for Baxter Shorter to say that he thought it was a break-in up to when they drove up to the curb and Santos said, "We'll send the woman up first," and Mary got out of the Oldsmobile, and then, only then, Shorter knew someone may be there in the house, and therefore Shorter himself wasn't guilty of first-degree murder, but they all were, because they'd anticipated Mabel Monaghan may be there. Someone would go up to the house, knock, or ring a bell. there are two versions. Inside the house, when Shorter went in, according to the evidence, he saw Mabel Monaghan's bleeding face. A few minutes after they went in, according to the evidence, we are led to believe that a cursory search occurred that was a few minutes only. True's evidence was that he went in after a couple of minutes. He and Santo and Perkins had waited outside, and Barbara Graham had knocked or rung a bell. The front door on the porch. There'd been a conversation for a minute or so. The door had opened after Mabel Monaghan had been watching through a peephole and talking to Mrs. Graham, and that Mrs. Graham, according to a prearranged plan, had said that she'd had car trouble or a tyre had blown, and could she use the telephone. After a minute or so, according to True and to Shorter, the front door opened. Mrs. Graham went in. According to Shorter, he saw the front door shut. According to True, at the grand jury earlier, the front door shut. True said he waited a couple of minutes. Santo told him to go in and see if Mrs. Monaghan had any guests. True said he went in. The door was shut. No door handle. He got in. How did True get in? Mrs. Graham certainly didn't go over to the door from the other side and let him in, because True's evidence was that after a couple of minutes he walked in and saw, bang, in the middle of Mrs. Graham, Barbara Graham, hitting, striking Mabel Monaghan 2 or 3 times with a gun butt in the face, and that's how the bleeding face was caused, that Shorter saw, allegedly later, after a search of a few minutes. So John True was not able to designate exactly whether it was 2 or 3 blows, even though, according to John True, it was right before him. He'd gotten in after a couple of minutes, a closed front door, and he saw this altercation. Mrs. Graham was striking Mabel Monaghan, Mrs. Monaghan, in the face with a gun butt 2 or 3 times, and Mrs. Graham was holding Mrs. Monaghan by the back of the neck or the hair and striking her with a gun butt with her right hand 2 or 3 times. Come on! She threw up her hands. Was she a would-be suicide? Did she not throw up her hands to protect herself after the first blow at least? She'd throw up her hands to ward off the second or third blows. She wasn't knocked out by the first blow, according to True. The incident didn't happen. It didn't happen there. At the grand jury, John True said the three men pushed in together with Barbara Graham at the same time. Mabel Monaghan opened the door. Barbara Graham started pistol whipping Mabel Monaghan immediately. Mrs. Monaghan fainted, he said, collapsed, fell to the floor, and John True said he knelt and held Mrs. Monaghan's head in his lap. Her face was bleeding. She'd screamed as they pushed their way in. Her face was bleeding. Yet, at the trial, John True said he'd waited a couple of minutes, gone in, and further in, as he'd entered, he'd seen Mrs. Graham striking Mrs. Monaghan 2 or 3 times. At the trial, John True said Perkins had come in then, tied Mrs. Monaghan's hands behind her back. No mention of a gag. Perkins had then dragged her through the house, down to the end of a hall, and there, True said, Barbara Graham put a pillowcase on over Mrs. Monaghan's head. Santa, who had entered by now, third, put a piece of sheet, or got a piece of cloth, he wasn't sure from where, but Santa wrapped the piece of cloth around Mrs. Monaghan's neck, and they then searched the house for a few minutes, and Santa then went out and got Shorter, said to be outside, brought him in, and the first thing that Shorter saw was Mabel Monaghan's face bleeding. Not the pillowcase. Not in the pillowcase. How could he see the bleeding face physically, visibly, as True alleged, and as the prosecution said Shorter saw, if her face was in the pillowcase? Her face had to be in the pillowcase if Barbara Graham covered it before they searched and Santa went out and got Shorter. Or the face was not bleeding at all before, because, certainly not because Barbara Graham had struck Mabel Monaghan 2 or 3 times earlier, because Mrs. Monaghan, it could be reasonably inferred, anybody could, would have thrown up her hands to ward off the blows. And True gave evidence that Mrs. Graham simply struck Mrs. Monaghan in the face 2 or 3 times, and strangely fainted and fell. This was his evidence at the grand jury. At the front door, he said, where There was no blood recorded, and the front door was shut before John True entered. Or Shorter, for Shorter, in his statement, said that he never even went into the house until 15 minutes later. And the front door was shut, as he said and True said. True, in his evidence at the grand jury, not the trial, fantastically said, when considered in context with the trial evidence he gave, that Mrs. Graham put the pillowcase over Mrs. Monaghan's head 15 minutes later, after they'd searched the whole house, ransacked it, thrown it into absolute disarray, torn up floorboards. There were no fingerprints to mention, no handprints, no fingerprints of any account. So somehow they covered this, and yet in 15 minutes or so later, in the grand jury version, Mrs. Mabel Monaghan had lain across or near the front door where True had alleged they all pushed in together, and Mrs. Graham, he'd alleged, had been with them after she got them in through the front door because she talked to Mabel Monaghan about the tyre and the car engine, and Mrs. Mabel Monaghan had opened the door to her, and Mrs. Graham had pistol whipped Mrs. Monaghan immediately at the front door. Then they'd gone on a search immediately after Mrs. Mabel Monaghan, he said, had actually fainted at the front door from fright, from fear. Certainly when she saw the three men, she'd screamed, but True said they entered and closed the front door. Nevertheless, they left her there in this grand jury version for 15 minutes, and then, True said, Perkins said, let's get her out of the door, the front door. So for 15 minutes she'd lain there, not been bound, not gagged, moaning, and they'd searched the house. It was then, after 15 minutes in this version, that True said Perkins tied Mrs. Monaghan's hands behind her back, and that they then carried her down to the end of the hall to a closet where Santa secured the pillowcase that True in this version said Barbara Graham had put on at the door over Mrs. Monaghan's head after 15 minutes. So in the trial version, the pillowcase was put on by Mrs. Graham, according to True, after a few minutes, and then they did a short search, and then Shorter came in and saw Mrs. Monaghan's face, not in the pillowcase, but her face visibly bleeding. An impossibility, unreasonable. A lie. And in the grand jury version, after 15 minutes, a total of 15 minutes, then it was, according to True, that Barbara Graham put the pillowcase on. But the bleeding face of Mrs. Monaghan could only have been caused earlier if she was hit once before she'd thrown up her arms in front of her face. As I said, she wasn't a kamikaze suicide flying into the blows of a gun, but she would have been hit once. Surprised, hit once without shielding herself, and that once was in the temple, that the evidence was given by the prosecution that Shorter saw Perkins do. Or True, said Shorter, saw Perkins do when he had a gun, according to Shorter. True. Struck Mrs. Mabel Monaghan in the temple, face. This was a direct evidence of who did the injuries and who caused the blow to the face, the blows to the face. And it was Emmett Perkins, either with a cane or with a gun, but not down the hall at the petition. There was the mass of blood. The evidence that True knelt down the end of the hall at the closet. Mrs. Monaghan was lying there. Shorter came in, saw her gagged. There was an altercation. Shorter threw Perkins off. Mrs. Monaghan yelled at True, "Take that gag off." True looked up at Santa, got permission, slashed the gag with a penknife. Shorter had thrown Perkins to the ground. They'd searched, had an altercation. There was no money found. Then Shorter went off and searched another room and found a bill with an address on it. Even though Shorter had cased Mrs. Mabel Monaghan's house in 1951 twice, then again, pre-dawn, March the 9th, 1953, he didn't know her address. He rang an ambulance that was booked. A police ambulance? How did Perkins and Santa come to know that Shorter had rung a police ambulance, an ambulance? Santa, of course, was told by Shorter, according to the evidence, that he was going to ring an ambulance. So Santa assumed. When police, corrupt police, told, according to John True, in a withheld statement of June the 4th, 1953, Perkins was told by corrupt police that he was wanted almost immediately after the murder of Mabel Monaghan. He knew he was wanted, and Santa knew, because Santa was back at the casino. Barbara Graham saw him. She saw him, she said, when she arrived at the casino at 4 a.m. or so on March the 10th. So corrupt police told Perkins he was wanted. He knew he was responsible for the bruises. Mrs. Mabel Monaghan had died. He knew, he thought. Shorter had rung an ambulance. Santa knew. He'd gone back in the car, one car with Santa, the two of them. And Shorter had said, "I'm going to ring an ambulance." And they'd stopped. And he'd done so at a service station after getting this bill, even though he knew the address surely. And in Shorter's story, the whole four men, the five of them, had gone back in one Oldsmobile, Truth, to Los Angeles and dropped him off, Shorter off. And then he'd found a payphone and rung the ambulance, which went to the wrong address, or searched for it in Los Angeles, because Shorter had not told the ambulance authorities that the address was in Burbank. But yet, Perkins and Santa had to have concluded that Shorter had betrayed them in that call to the ambulance, surely. Because how else would they know that the police knew immediately, almost immediately, that Jack and Emmett were Jack Santo and Emmett Perkins. And Perkins was the one who was told he was wanted for murder almost immediately before the body was found. Perkins murdered Baxter Shorter sometime after April the 14th. Santo was present, and True told Bernice Freeman in 1954 that he was present also. No mention in this context was made of Barbara Graham because she wasn't there at this event, and True never alleged she was. When Baxter Shorter was killed, she was at the auto courts in Los Angeles. She fled. She was on parole. She panicked, she said. She was told by Perkins that they were all wanted for murder when she arrived on March the 10th, around 4 a.m. And yet, Perkins was the only one told he was wanted for murder. So he roped her in. He knew her schedule. He knew she'd left. Her husband had left an hour or so before, an hour or two or so before, around 4 a.m. That's why she'd come to the casino. Perkins knew this, and Perkins knew he was wanted for murder for what he thought were the bruises that he knew he'd caused when he'd hit Mrs. Monaghan in the temple and several times caused all the massive blood at the petition, not the entryway. And Perkins knew this when he saw Mrs. Graham. Alleged Shorter called Mary to get out of a break-in, to get a break-in. He knew at the last minute, only at the last minute, Shorter did, that Mrs. Mabel Monaghan was there. But she lives in the house, he was told on March the 8th in added evidence. But Shorter said he'd never met Mrs. Graham. Shorter said he'd never met Mary before in his life until the evening of March the 9th, when he met her when she got out of a car with two men and got into a dark blue Oldsmobile and gone up, and they'd called her Mary. And Truett said she'd gone up in a car with him and Santo in one car, and Shorter and Perkins had gone up, the two of them together with no woman, in another car to Mrs. Monaghan's house in Burbank. And True, in a statement he made to police on June the 4th, 1953, 2 days after he gave his evidence of conspiracy of Barbara Graham, because, he said, she'd been there on the 8th at a meeting with the four of them, and that she'd been called Mary, and Shorter had met her there at Ventura Boulevard on March the 8th, and she'd been present, and that Perkins had said the old lady who lives in the house might spook easy. She may not open the door to a guy at night. Because of this, and of a casing on the 8th, March the 8th with Upshaw, and Upshaw gave evidence of Barbara Graham being there. Because of this, Barbara Graham was indicted for conspiracy at the grand jury. Barbara Graham was indicted for conspiracy on June the 2nd on True's evidence and Upshaw's, but True on June the 4th in San Francisco, surprisingly, to say the least, fantastically, it's more like it, recorded that he met Barbara Graham for the first time ever in his life on March the 9th. And yet this statement was withheld from the trial and only surfaced when police brought it to the subcommittee in 1960. The evidence that Mrs. Graham was at the meeting of March the 8th depended upon her being present in the presence of all four men at the same time when the words were said. And Shorter and True, two of the men alleged to be there in the circle, in the ring with her, said themselves they weren't even there. And Shorter and True, two men alleged to be in the ring when she was there, said themselves that they met her for the first time on the next day, March the 9th. So, she wasn't there in the presence of all of them, and therefore she wasn't there. The evidence depended on them all being there together, let alone a conspiracy. And Shorter said that he didn't even meet Jack and Emmett until March the 9th. So Shorter said he himself wasn't there. Only True was the consistent one. And Upshaw's evidence appeared for the 26th, March the 26th, around there, or added later when he was brought in again. Nevertheless, claimed that Mrs. Graham was there at a casing of Mrs. Mabel Monaghan's house on March the 8th, in the presence of Shorter, True, Upshaw himself, Santa, and Perkins, and again Shorter said he never met the woman they called Mary or Jack and Emmett until March the 9th, and True himself, in the withheld June the 4th statement, said he never met Barbara Graham until March the 9th. So, Upshaw's evidence that she was present with three men who said either they weren't there or she wasn't there was a lie. And True told Bernice Freeman he met Barbara Graham in Los Angeles. He met her for the first time on March the 9th, and then he said he met her in Los Angeles, He said he met her on March the 9th at El Monte, and now, in 1954, he came to say a different statement. He met her in Los Angeles. He told Bernice Freeman. He told the trial in August. He met her first on March the 7th with Perkins. They discussed the plan. Why? Because he put her in front of the 8th and therefore could meet her on March the 8th by the time of the trial. A well-knitted web knitting her into the conspiracy. And now she lived with Perkins for the 3 days and had a sexual liaison with Santo in the 2 months leading up to the week of the murder, because it was coincidental that she worked for Perkins, and the evidence was submitted even though Furno was shadowing Santo and Perkins and made no mention of a liaison with Barbara Graham, or even mentioned Barbara Graham before Shorter did when he entered the police precincts around March the 26th and said that the 3 men, Jack, Emmett and John, had called a woman Mary. And then Rubel had associated her because, he said, he knew a woman worked for Perkins, and that woman turned out to be Barbara Graham. A 5'3", very attractive 28-year-old. It had a record for non-violent crimes, but one for perjury. A few years before, she'd served almost a year, been forgiven by the person whom she'd originally harmed by lying in court. And as her defence counsel said, in the Mabel Monaghan murder, she was not on trial for any lying in other situations or for her conduct morally in 1953, but on trial for whether she murdered Mabel Monaghan, or did John True, who gave evidence at the grand jury. I ran my hand between the gun and the lady's face and said, "Don't hit her anymore." In the context that Mrs. Monaghan would have raised her hands herself and shielded her face from any gun that did exist, unless it was a case of True striking her with the gun, and the hand that was run between the gun and the face, the bleeding face of Mabel Monaghan, was her own, Mrs. Mabel Monaghan's hands, and True was the true assaulter of her, not Barbara Graham. Wasn't there. There was never any pistol whipping. Perkins made this declaration 2 weeks or so before he died, before he was executed. In other words, a dying declaration. There was never any pistol whipping. John True, the prosecution's chief witness against Barbara Graham, said Barbara Graham pistol whipped Mabel Monaghan at the front door of her house, just inside. At the grand jury, that's what John True said. At the trial, he alleged instead that Barbara Graham pistol whipped Mrs. Monaghan in the face 2 or 3 times in the entryway of her house, just inside the front door, and that this caused the face injuries. Perkins, as I have said, confessed two weeks before his execution that there was no pistol whipping. There was never any pistol whipping. There were several wounds to Mrs. Mabel Monaghan's head. The autopsy surgeon told the court. This includes the face. Mabel was hit in the head, including the face, at the area where the mass of blood was, where the blood was smeared, and that was at the partition that was further inside the house, at the border of the end of the entryway and the living room. And she was not hit at the front door or just inside in the entryway, as John True alleged in 2 different stories, one at the grand jury and the other at the trial. Much was made of a statement that Barbara Graham said in jail. The statement was, quote, "I was with them," close quotes. She made the statement to an undercover policeman, an agent of the DA, Ernest Roll. He was deliberately put in because Barbara Graham's husband had disappeared before the murder, and it was not known whether Barbara Graham could have had an alibi from her husband. It was not known what date he left on. Barbara Graham's word was not good enough. The impression was given that the undercover agent was offered $500 after he gave a false alibi for Barbara Graham in court, and that she would walk free and pay him $500. We are asked to believe that a story would go over in which an undercover agent, posing as a real criminal, would honestly believe he'd ever get paid that amount? Barbara Graham was destitute. She had a court-appointed lawyer. The story is frivolous. Not believable. In any case, it was not disputed later that the move on Barbara Graham to inveigle her into a situation where she was tempted to try to get a false alibi from a agent posing as someone who would provide it, as a criminal who would provide it, it was not disputed later by the prosecution that they deliberately, underhandedly trapped her or induced her into it. And she took the bait and did it. She tried to get Siriani, the police officer's name, Siriani, who was posing as a friend of a fellow inmate, Donna Prow. Barbara Graham tried to get him to say that he was with her at the time of the early morning hours of March the 10th, 1953. In a motel, she would be in bed with him at that time, and that would set her free, except the murder was established to have taken place just after 7 p.m. on March the 9th, 1953, when Barbara Graham alleged she was at home rowing and fighting with her husband, having rows, and the time that it was recorded by Siriani that Barbara Graham wanted him to alibi her for was not even the time when the murder took place. Why? She must have known. Why? She'd known from the indictment that the murder took place at 7 p.m, yet she was so fixed in her mind that it was a day later at the wrong time that she tried to obtain an alibi to get her out of the gas chamber for the wrong day. And this is acknowledged and recorded by Siriani, posing as an undercover policeman, in the transcript of written evidence he gave in memory of what Barbara Graham said to him in an interview in the cell, but it was blurred by the jail noise in the background in the tape. But nevertheless, Siriani acknowledged this, and yet the DA role, Prosecutor J. Miller Levy, his assistant Adolf Alexander, went ahead and said that Barbara Graham's attempt to obtain a false alibi, which she hadn't, it had been thrust upon her, the opportunity, and she'd been lured and inveigled into it, in breach of Cahan's case later, which wasn't applied retrospectively to her, but in any case, she made the statement, quote, "I was with them," quote, "in desperation and on the condition that she confessed to being there at the time Siriani in a prearranged approach upon her and script, said he would not give her the false alibi unless she acknowledged that she was there with them on March the 9th, because he was afraid of Baxter Shorter appearing again and contradicting them. And we are expected to believe that this Barbara Graham initiated and orchestrated herself. Adolf Alexander said, Barbara Graham's husband finally did turn up and ultimately said that he was with her on March the 9th. But initially he didn't. He came back and he changed his evidence. That indicates a previous inconsistent statement or a subsequent one. But surely this man, calculating back to his unemployment check, trying to work it out, was at least behaving far more honestly and not saying things in her interest, even though he was her husband, and trying to work it out objectively, which is nothing like what John True, the prosecution criminal who turned state's evidence and got immunity, and she refused, made a massive inconsistency, such as he said Barbara Graham returned with him and Perkins after the murder to a motel at which he and Santo were staying, called La Bonita, and she helped him wash the blood off his trousers, the blood of Mabel Monaghan. Yet, 2 or so months before this, when he made that statement at the trial to convict her and get at establishing her being with them at the house on March the 9th, when she thought it was March the 10th, 2 months or so before that, in San Francisco, John True told police he washed the blood off his trousers in Los Angeles himself. La Bonita was in El Monte. This discrepancy was described, or certainly types like it were described by the prosecutor in 1960 at the subcommittee which was investigating the procedures into Barbara Graham's case as, quote, immaterial inconsistencies, close quotes. Perjury, lying is the word. Adolf Alexander, the assistant prosecutor, in his summing up, admitted that Barbara Graham, at home on March the 9th, was fighting with her husband. He said, that is, Adolf Alexander said, quote, March the 9th was a very, very fatal and eventful day in the life of Mrs. Graham. She remembered it because of a fight with her husband. March the 9th was the exact date that Siriani questioned Barbara Graham on, after she had denied she was there in the prison cell. She'd said, I was at home mostly, when Siriani had first asked her. He then persisted and cornered her, and like a shark attacking, wouldn't objectively look at what she was saying and question whether she was telling the truth. After all, She'd been in prison originally, arrested on $25,000 bail for forging checks, not murder in the first place. Why? Why was it such an exorbitant amount? To hold her so she couldn't get out and get at witnesses like the neighbours, who turned up finally and gave evidence in court, which led to Adolf Alexander summing up, as I said, the very date that Siriani said he'd questioned her on in the cell, and that she'd admitted and said, "I was with them," after he'd asked her, "You were with those four guys on March the 9th when all that went down," in the context of after she denied she was with them 6 or 7 times, but it was blurred on the tape, of course, and she'd also said, "I was at home mostly." After that, nevertheless, despite all that, notwithstanding, at the trial, after the neighbours had given evidence, and Barbara Graham and her husband, relevant to March the 9th, Adolf Alexander summed up again, quote, "March the 9th was a very, very fateful and eventful day in the life of Mrs. Graham. She remembered it because of her fight with her husband. And I was wondering where," this is what Alexander said, "when you heard that, you gathered the impression that fighting was a continuous deal there. Fights were very common. A very usual thing in the life of Mrs. Graham," close quote, "as if that is a crime, fighting with your husband. Wives and husbands fighting. But nevertheless, it's an admission by Alexander at the bar table that he knew, on behalf of the prosecution, that Barbara Graham was at home on March the 9th, the night of the murder. So, he introduced letters of Barbara Graham and Donna Prower. Candy pants, Barbara Graham called her. This is 1953, way before Barbara Stanwyck, Marlene Dietrich, Greta Garbo, etc., etc., could get away with being bisexual. But nevertheless, to get a conviction and completely smear Barbara Graham and denigrate her character, which was not good in the area of misdemeanors, but that's all. She had no record of violence whatsoever. So knowing that the jury knew and had heard, the neighbours, the evidence, the front door was closed, both Baxter Shorter and John True said at the grand jury that after the intruders entered Mrs. Mabel Monaghan's home, when she opened the door, Shorter said he saw the front door close immediately then, and John True said as soon as they got inside, he with them, they shut the front door. The handle was outside on a turn that whereas a door is closed into the street in Burbank in 1953 where prowl cars went past every half an hour and Warner Brothers was around the corner at Burbank and lots of money in the area and prowl cars went past, police cars every half hour, and Mabel Monaghan's ex-son-in-law was a high roller gambler. She had massive security on the house, as in double bolts inside the door, a peephole, the windows blacked out, a partition across the living room so that nobody could see inside. Are we to believe that she had a handle on the outside of the door into the street that could be turned when the front door closed? I don't think so. Which means that the front door was closed after whoever got in, and John True admitted he got in, and Perkins admitted he was there. And Santa? Shorter? But the point is that the front door was closed, and at the trial John True said that Barbara Graham went in first. He waited outside. He, John True, and all of the men waited outside for a couple of minutes. So when he was told to go in by Santa and check on Barbara Graham and see what was happening, whether there were any guests, he went in and saw Barbara Graham hitting Mrs. Mabel Monaghan 2 or 3 times in the entryway. The front door was closed. Handle, very doubtful. He couldn't get in. It would have closed against him. And also Perkins, 2 weeks before he died, said there was never any pistol whipping. There was never any pistol whipping. So John True, it seems, could not have seen anything that took place, and also the head injuries included the face injuries where the blood was, which was further in at the partition, at the living room, at the entryway, at a point where John True had not said that Barbara Graham had struck Mrs. Mabel Monaghan with an invention, a gun butt, suddenly appeared in the evidence. With no foundation, no earlier basis, as True admitted he had not seen Barbara Graham with a gun when he alleged she'd gone up to the house with him in a car. But he would not have seen her with a gun because she wasn't even in the car with him, as you will see later. Shorter said they all went over in one car. Shorter said they all went over in True's Oldsmobile. All of them. Perkins, Santo, Barbara, True, and Shorter said they all went over in the one car. In a bubble, like in a bubble. And so lo and behold, True said they went over in 2 cars. At the trial, True said Barbara, she went over with him and Santo in one car, and that Shorter, Baxter Shorter, travelled over to Mabel Monaghan's home with Perkins in one other car. Was it Shorter's? What happened to Shorter's car? How did he get to the rendezvous? Said to be the smokehouse, in some stories. Said to be El Monte, a drive-in eatery in others, in Shorter's story. And Upshaw's, presumably. So, we had an amazing anomaly. 2 cars went over, according to Arch Chief Prosecution Witness, who put Barbara Graham in the gas chamber and named her as Mary. Shorter saw in the Oldsmobile with them all going over when she was in one car with True, according to True, and with Santo, who said when they arrived, "We'll send the woman up first," meaning her, Shorter said, and he saw. He saw because he was in the one car with her, he said, and Santo, who said the words, and John True and Emmett Perkins, and she stepped out onto the curb. At the curb, Shorter said, in her high-heel shoe, and she got up there, up to the path. And yet True, at the same time and space, outside Mabel Monaghan's house in the area, when the cars arrived and there were two, Barbara stepped out, again in her high-heel shoe, from not the Oldsmobile they were all in together, and Shorter saw, at the behest and hearing Santo's words, but True said, at the other car she got out and stepped into the curb, crossed the footpath, and went up the path to the front door at the porch and rang a bell, or knocked. We are not sure. So, here we had two versions, neither Shorter nor True corroborating each other that she was there, and exactly negating, establishing an ambiguity, proving she was not there, framed for the woman on the 8th, March the 8th, who on June the 4th, True said, he met first for the first time in his life on March the 9th. She, the woman on March the 8th, turned out to be the same woman there in the evening on March the 9th, just after 7 p.m, who stepped out of two different cars in her high-heel shoes at once and went up to the door, my lord, and went up to the door. I say it's a fiction. A framing of her, Barbara Graham, identified as Mary, a woman heard, said Shorter, called Mary by Perkins to Santo in different cars, and was told by Santo as they drove over and called her Mary to go up to the door, because Santo said, we'll send the woman up first, when Shorter was in the other car and went up with Perkins alone to the Mabel Monaghan home to do the murder, according to True, the great liar maker. And that's how she was established to be there. Mary to be Barbara Graham, identified by Rubel, as at the evening of the March the 9th had a discussion with them all at the smokehouse, and couldn't get out of her car, step out in her high-heel shoe, because she'd be split down the middle and two persons in each other car. Shorter and True saw, with Perkins at the same time, and Perkins was supposed to have said in front of her on March the 8th at the smokehouse again, the old lady who lives in the house might spook easy. she may not open the door to a guy at night. And this, added later, True alleged, Perkins said to Shorter in her presence, and Shorter said he never met her. That was the implication of his evidence, because he said he met the mystical Mary for the first time on March the 9th at 2 cars, when True's evidence and Shorter's statement was read together. A massive ambiguity, unreasonable and judicially reviewable, and requires certiorari, a declaration that the conclusions drawn in the Barbara Graham case derived from True's evidence. Adolf Alexander said, and her attempts to obtain a false alibi, and her fleeing the Supreme Court said, and her being lesbian, bisexual, the letters to Donna Prowl said, who lured her into trying to obtain a false alibi in the context of jail authorities, and DA Roll seeing her letters, and the lawyer's letter of hers saying she'd go to the gas chamber if she didn't have an alibi, and they secretly then infiltrated policewoman Shirley Olsen, who got Donna Prowl to lure Barbara Graham, her friendship, and betray her in a shockingly treacherous personal way, and terrify the living daylights out of her, and get her to try to obtain a false alibi from a policeman undercover. And he, in written evidence, because the tapes were of no use because of the background noise, convenient, wrote written transcripts about what he remembered was said. What the transcripts said were, you were with those 4 guys on March the 9th when all that went down, and Barbara Graham, according to Siriani, the undercover man, had said the murder happened in the early hours of the morning of March the 10th. So here we have an ill woman who's in jail, believes she's obtaining a false alibi for the wrong time of the murder she believes happened a day after, and we are expected to believe that this attempt to obtain a false alibi meant anything other than that she was futile, confused, massively deranged by the pressure, terrifying, of her husband disappearing and finally being brought in on the last day of court or so, and calculating back honestly, at least, works out the day must have been the 7th or 8th of March when he left. So not giving an alibi for March the 9th, but giving an alibi for March the 7th and possibly the 8th, when True said she was at the smokehouse and her husband said it was either the 7th or 8th, and Shorter and True both said they met her first on March the 9th. But our intrepid friend John True, friend indeed, for the prosecution, was not to be put down, and he changed his evidence just before the trial and found that he'd actually met Barbara Graham first for the first time on March the 7th. And we are expected to believe this man over Barbara Graham, who refused immunity because she didn't have any evidence because she wasn't there. In 2 cars, she went up. In 2 cars at once. Went up in 2 cars. Went up. When they left the murder scene, it was alleged by Baxter Shorter, in a statement he made when he approached police around about March the 26th, that a woman was in the car with him after the murder and that he thought they called her Mary. He didn't say her name was Barbara Graham, and we're not sure if he identified her later. One author, Bernice Freeman, says he did. This is not mentioned by Kathleen A. Cairns, another expert author on the facts of this case, to whom I owe much, and Clark Howard for his excellent review, peer review, and Joan Renner, social historian. And I urge you to see all these authors' accounts of this terrible murder event. I've never seen anyone crazy enough to work with a woman, Shorter is alleged to have said on the way down back after the murder. Said to Santa and True and Perkins and Mary, the woman in the car, as Shorter said, she sat next to Santa. But John True, the arch witness for the prosecution, Shorter was dead. He'd been killed by Perkins and Santa, and according to John True was present when he was killed. He told Bernice Freeman in 1954. But according to Shorter himself made this statement in front of them all, the woman, Mary, after asking and whether they thought that Mabel Monaghan would die. And the allegation was by Shorter that Perkins replied she can handle herself, referring to Mary, a woman no man would be crazy enough to work with, even though Baxter Shorter worked with his wife, Olivia, breaking in as career criminals. The only problem with this is that John True gave evidence at the trial that going back, Baxter Shorter was with Santa in one car alone, and that he, John True, went back to La Bonita with Barbara Graham and Perkins, where he did the infamous washing the blood off his trousers after the murder, even though he told police in San Francisco that he went to Los Angeles and washed the blood off his trousers himself and made no mention of Barbara Graham. So we have Mary in one car, established as being there because she's there, and the statement of a woman crazy enough implying that she was responsible somehow for the murder, or at least had gotten them in the front door by approaching Mabel Monaghan's house, walking up the path after she'd gotten out of a car, one of theirs, one of the cars, or one car, according to Shorter, as we shall see later. And yet, Shorter and Santo, according to True, were in a separate car going back, and obviously had nothing to do with her going back in another car, if she was there in the other car at all. As read together, it is impossible that she was there. The manner in which she'd been transported back, draw the logical conclusion, and no other conclusion is possible, that she was split in two, or had a double, or had a twin, or was with Harriet Henson, which is all impossible, as Harriet Henson gave evidence later for the defence and would have exposed So Adolf Alexander, admitting, in summing up, that Barbara Graham was at home on March the 9th, rowing with her husband, must, if he was objective and applying the ethics that the subcommittee looked into in 1960, where the prosecution has a duty on itself to be objective and investigate openly and find the right person who did this, and that the end doesn't justify the means, and the terrible, shocking murder, slaying of Mabel Monaghan justifies executing the right person, people who did it, but not the wrong and the duty of the detectives, Siriani, the policeman, Rubel, detective, Coveney, Los Angeles, and Burbank detectives respectively, D.A. Roll, J. Miller Levy, Adolf Alexander. On them, at their feet, can be laying the responsibility that they absolved and didn't do, and should have approached Barbara Graham's case objectively and realised that nothing else, she was ill. She said in her testimony that she was fighting all day with her husband. And this is borne out by Adolf Alexander's admission from the bar table, which I've just quoted before. She said that her husband left her around 4 a.m. in the morning of March the 10th, and she went over to Perkins at his casino at El Monte. She lived at Los Angeles. She drove over in one version. Perkins picked her up in another. Nevertheless, 4 a.m. she got there, or he got her. Perkins knew where she was, her schedule, and where her husband was or where he wasn't. And that was the opportunity, the opening he was waiting for, because he could say to her, establish in her head that the murder that he was wanted for eventually, and knew possibly he would be, and if caught would go to the gas chamber. He put in her mind that the murder he had committed, and Santa, and True, Shorter had been present, took place in the early morning hours of March the 10th, just when her ability, her time, covered by an alibi, by her husband, who had left and disappeared, was wishy-washy. William Upshaw was used as a witness to corroborate John True, identifying Barbara Graham as Mary at March the 9th at the house of Mabel Monaghan. William Upshaw said that he had cased Mabel Monaghan's house. William Upshaw said that he had cased Mabel Monaghan's house with John True, Barbara Graham, Perkins, Santo and Shorter, Baxter Shorter, on March the 8th. But Baxter Shorter, in his statement around the 26th of March, said he never met Mary, the mythical Mary, the name he thought he heard them call her, the mystery woman of March the 9th who went up with them in 2 cars, but one at the same time, as we shall see, and up to the porch, rang a bell or not, when True said Shorter parked in a car with Perkins around the corner, and there were vines all over a trellis that half covered the porch. How could Shorter see her there? But, he said, he saw the door close, the front door close, after she went in, behind the trellis and vines, and he'd seen her get out of 2 cars at once with True's evidence. 2 cars at once with True's evidence. And I have assumed later, with a sense of hyperbole and comedy, which I can't help, and a sense of absurdity, that she got out of these cars with her sexy legs and high heel shoes, because after all, the reason that Barbara Graham seems to really have been convicted is because of a sinister, pernicious jealousy of an attractive woman who was, as they called her, sexy, bloody Babs, blonde bombshell type, they called her at one stage, even though, guess what, she had reddish hair, and this famously appeared in the statement of March the 8th, at which she was alleged to be at the smokehouse on the same date as the casing took place, that Upshaw referred to in evidence made later around May the 13th, and in preparation for the grand jury hearing on June the 2nd, at which he said she was at the casing, and the same had been said of her, supposedly, at the smokehouse on March the 8th, when she had, according to True, been there with Shorter, and they discussed sending a woman up to the door with Shorter. The woman, named Mary, True alleged, was there, and Perkins told Shorter that the old lady who lives in the house might spook easy, and that a guy may not get in the door at night. But why was he there, Perkins? Why had he contacted Shorter? Why share with another safecracker? When Perkins was an expert safecracker, why share? The answer's obvious. Baxter Shorter was there because Perkins knew, and Santo knew because they prepared, and True knew they prepared and planned up in California, Northern California, that Baxter Short had once intended to break into the house with William Upshaw in 1951 and dropped the plan, and that Baxter Shorter and William Upshaw, Baxter Shorter particularly, knew Mabel Monaghan and could get in because True told Bernice Freeman in 1954 not that a woman could get in at night, but that Mabel Monaghan would only let anyone in, male or female, whichever gender, if she knew them. If she knew them. True knew this, and the plan, when the plan was made. And that's why they contacted Baxter Shorter and William Upshaw. And Shorter said he never heard of Perkins or Santo until March the 9th. So he was saying he wasn't there on March the 8th. Shorter was saying that he himself, Shorter, wasn't there on March the 8th. So with the ring of people there, there was no woman proved to be there because they all had to be together in a conspiracy ring. And Shorter and True, in a statement of June the 4th, 1953, John True stated he never met Barbara Graham until the day of the murder, March the 9th, not March the 8th, and not March the 8th when William Upshaw said she was with them and cased the place. So two of them, Shorter and True, who were supposed to be with Upshaw and her on the day before, swore themselves they didn't even know her then and weren't there with her, therefore. And Adolf Alexander, admitted that on March the 9th she was at home rowing with her husband, and the neighbours had heard all week. So Barbara Graham was convicted, sent to the gas chamber, because her lawyer's letter was seen by jail authorities when it passed by them, and he told her that she'd go to the gas chamber if she couldn't remember, have an alibi, where she was and where she'd been. And she said, I racked my brains to remember. And she did. But on that date, March the 9th, it is clear that Adolf Alexander, in his summing up, knew that she was not there and convicted her, in effect, for aspects that he alleged were in her character. It's interesting if you believe in the subconscious, because when Barbara Graham was arrested on May the 4th and appeared in court at arraignment on May the 5th, she's reported as automatically saying that she hadn't seen her husband and child for 2 months. Most people think 28 days make up a month. She'd been at school, elementary school, a Catholic school, when she was young. She was a frustrated poetess, although she'd had some work published, she said, and her opportunities in life had completely been thwarted and denied, and she'd ended up a prostitute. Good-looking one, and very successful. She'd been high class, waterfront tart as well. And all these aspects, not violent, went against her, and her bisexual Donna Prow relationship put her in the gas chamber. But 28 days back per month, multiplied twice, 56, makes back exactly March the 10th. She hadn't seen her husband and child since. Much was made of a sexual liaison after the event that she was supposed to have had with Santa, and that she was living with Perkins for these 3 days or so. There is no evidence of this, no direct evidence of this, and it conveniently is implied after she was convicted or after the event, if you assume, as the prosecution's approach was, that she did it. Furneaux had been shadowing Santa and Harriet Henson, Perkins, the casino. No evidence was given. Other than that, Santa visited the casino in the months before, the 2 months before the murder, and that the casino had a back room and that he stayed there, and that Barbara Graham worked part-time, it seems, but even full-time, had worked there at the casino in El Monte from Los Angeles, where she lived, and that the casino coincidentally had a back room. And the prosecution, at least the legend, the history, put 2 and 2 together and came up with a score of a 10 sexual union, which she vehemently denied and said that she hardly knew Santa, and she met John True once, and she'd never met Baxter Shorter nor Mabel Monaghan. She worked for Perkins. Mary, a prostitute name, alleged to be how Detective Rubel linked a woman, an employee of Perkins, with Shorter's allegation that Mary, they called her Mary, on March the 9th, in the car, Perkins and Santa, and True was there, according to Shorter, but not according to True at that time. This is how Mary was linked as being there on March the 9th. Some sort of event occurred before that, and Shorter a break-in he put forward as a ploy. He thought it was on March the 8th. And yet, he must have been very naive, because, on his own admission, he, Upshaw and True, nothing to do with a woman. He said, cased Mabel Monaghan's house before dawn on March the 9th, and that the floodlights were on, and that he, Shorter, thought, oh, that means nobody's there. This is absurd. How would they turn on and off if somebody wasn't there? And Mabel Monaghan actually did turn them on at sunset and turn them off the next morning. Shorter wasn't to know that, although he was an original planner in 1951 and he'd cased the house then. And it seems he knew Mabel Monaghan's ex-son-in-law, Tudor Shearer, who transferred the house to his former wife, Mabel's daughter, and Mabel's daughter had given the house to Mabel because she was fond of it, and strangely enough, True said to Bernice Freeman in 1954 that Santo, up in Auburn, when he and True planned the robbery, True said Santo knew this, all the details of the divorce in advance, and all that he said about Barbara Graham when he was grilled, asked by Bernice Freeman, where does Barbara Graham come in? All that John True said in 1954 was vaguely, oh, she was around. Bernice Freeman asked, where? In Nevada City? In other words, up there when the plan was made between True and Santo? No, was the reply by John True. In Los Angeles. We all went down. We all went down? Who? Santo, True, Harriet Henson, Santo's girlfriend, common law wife. We all went down to Los Angeles. We all went down, and that's where I met her. I say that John True met Barbara Graham on March the 11th or 12th, only because he must have left after March the 10th, and the story that he left before that is, he gave at the trial on March the 10th at midnight, he and Santo, he said, left Southern California, is ridiculous. If he left then, because he said in San Francisco in the statement that he knew that Perkins had been told by corrupt police that he was wanted for murder. That is Perkins. Almost immediately after the murder of Mabel Monaghan on March the 9th. How did he know when the body wasn't even discovered until 11:15 a.m. on March the 11th? He never spoke to Perkins or Santo again, according to the information. He never saw them again until the trial, when he turned state's evidence against them. He left on the 11th, and Barbara Graham had flown to the Auto Courts with Perkins, and it seems Santo, even though True said Santo went back to Northern California. Another direct conflict. But the Auto Courts were in Los Angeles, and True left from Los Angeles because earlier, a day or so, he'd washed the blood off in Los Angeles, not La Bonita at El Monte, and that's where he met her and ultimately framed her, because Perkins, Santo, and Shorter before and Upshaw had to have a forewoman, because the plan way up there in Auburn in the beginning had always been to murder Mabel Monaghan. And at the trial, True pretended he didn't know anything of the plan to rob Mabel Monaghan until it was well underway. And that means the dates March 7th, 8th and 9th, when they all came down, meaning not Barbara Graham, who lived in Los Angeles and simply worked for Perkins at the casino at El Monte. So True lied again, because in the San Francisco statement he said he'd been almost an initiator of the plan up in Auburn, and that all he knew of Barbara Graham was that she was around down in Los Angeles, and they all came down. And contacted Shorter, who knew Mabel Monaghan. And up to a peephole and got in. And Shorter saw the front door close. Saw, he said, and yet according to John True, Shorter was parked in a car and a vine trellis was in the way, and he couldn't see, surely. And Shorter couldn't see anything of a door closing, anyone on the porch, anyone going up to the path, because Baxter Shorter himself walked up it and went in and got him because he knew Mabel Monaghan and he's a friend of her ex-son-in-law Tudor Shearer, and betrayed her brutally, and she was murdered, and he feigned that he didn't know that it wouldn't be a break-in earlier and before, and he and Upshaw conspired with True, Perkins, Santo on March the 8th and or March the 9th, and Upshaw in terror pulled out before on March the 9th because he knew that Mabel Monaghan was at home and lived there, and when they cased the place pre-dawn with John True, because on were the floodlights from the eaves. And Shorter and Upshaw and True knew perfectly well at dawn on March the 9th, Mabel Monaghan lived there, was living there, and it was a murder intended. And the frame was to place Mary in, appearing. I seen her. She was just a woman with Mr. Perkins. Magically appearing suddenly at the motel on March the 9th, when Barbara Graham said she was in Los Angeles at the grocer's. But she confessed to it all. Yeah, according to J. Miller Levy, the chief prosecutor told the subcommittee in 1960, don't worry about going into it all. And they adjourned. It's probably still in abeyance today because J. Miller Levy discovered that she had confessed to pistol whipping Mabel Monaghan until dead. And J. Miller Levy forgot, was schizophrenic, perhaps, like he thought Barbara Graham, perhaps, alleged, because J. Miller Levy, the chief prosecutor himself, tendered the surgeon's report at the trial of Barbara Graham that proved Mabel Monaghan was not pistol whipped to death, but strangled. And Barbara Graham was not ever accused of strangling Mabel Monaghan or pistol whipping her at the petition in Mabel Monaghan's house, which bore the massive blood and the rug further down the hall that the gardener found and first saw in the morning of March the 9th when he entered the house and saw first the massive blood at the partition. No blood did he report at the entryway or on the door or smeared on the front door on either side, nor did Officer Lane of the Burbank Police, who was the first officer on the scene. And Perkins, Santa, Barbara Graham were executed in the afternoon and morning of June the 3rd, 1955 for this crime. Perkins thought that the body had been found on March the 10th, when he had been informed by corrupt police, according to John True, that he, Perkins, alone was wanted, not Barbara Graham at that stage. And Perkins was wanted for vicious, shocking previous murders, and it must have been a shocking coincidence, an incredible coincidence, if True told the truth on this point, that police, particularly a man named Furno, undercover, was shadowing Santo and Perkins, the Jack Santo gang, for these murders. And the call must have come through, if it did, if True told the truth, on March the 10th, and Perkins thought it was for the murder of Mabel Monaghan. The police had called him, corrupt police, to inform him of, and Perkins thought the body had been found, but it wasn't until March the 11th. This is based on True saying that he and Santo left Southern California at 12 midnight on March the 10th, and he never spoke to Santo Perkins again. If True was lying about when they left, then he left after Mabel Monaghan's body was found on the 11th, March the 11th, and then corrupt police tipped off Emmett Perkins, not for the murders previously, but indeed for Mabel Monaghan's murder. But Perkins alone at that time was suspected because Detective Rubel knew Perkins, had known him for 13 years, and the name Emmett was said by Shorter later, around March the 26th, to Burbank Police. Not the surname. Rubel put two and two together, knowing that Perkins was being shadowed. Yet it is strange that corrupt police told Perkins he was wanted. If it was for the Mabel Monaghan murder and True was lying, and he left later from Southern California, say the 11th or 12th, it is strange that corrupt police knew of Emmett Perkins and linked him with the Mabel Monaghan murder as early as March the 10th or 11th or 12th. And True told Bernice Freeman in 1954 he met Barbara Graham in Los Angeles, not at Ventura Boulevard or El Monte on March the 8th and 9th. And he said he met her when he came down from Northern California with Santo after he and Santo had devised a plan to rob Mabel Monaghan's house. And murder her surely, as they had to have no witnesses, as J. Miller Levy, the chief prosecutor, said at the trial.